In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, and may the peace and mercy of Allah be upon His last and beloved Messenger Muhammad, and may the peace and mercy of Allah be upon you all. The title of this episode is Understanding the Phenomena of Fatigue in Materials from the Noble Quran, from the last revelation of Allah God to people. So in this episode I will show, Allah God willing, how to understand the following phenomena. That when a material, for example, is subjected to cyclic loading, to this kind of action of loading, cyclic loading, after a certain number of times it experiences fatigue, it fractures due to this cyclic loading. How can we understand this phenomena from the Noble Quran completely? Now, to start with, we need to understand the atom. Since matter is composed of atoms, we need to understand the design of the atom. And Allah the Almighty explains to us in the Noble Quran how to understand the design of the atom completely. And this can be done by pondering and reflecting upon the verses of the Noble Quran and not just merely reciting them. So Allah the Almighty states in the last revelation to people, in chapter 67 verse 3 the following: Who has created the seven heavens, one above another, you can see no fault in the creations of the most beneficent. And then look again, can you see any rifts? So if we ponder and reflect upon this verse, we see that Allah Almighty states here and teaches us His methodology, His way in creation. And the methodology of the Almighty is to create a central object surrounded by seven heavens or seven layers. So the way of Allah the Almighty in creation, as I said, to create a central object surrounded by seven heavens or seven layers. Now, since Allah the Almighty is one, this means that His creation, His methodology in creation is constant, which means that we can learn from this that the atom should be composed of a central object surrounded by seven layers or seven heavens. So as you can see on the screen, this is the design of the atom as deduced, as learned from the Noble Quran, a central object which is now called the nucleus, surrounded by seven heavens, seven layers, seven spheres. Now, Allah the Almighty also teaches us the energy within the heaven, the energy within these seven layers or seven heavens of the atom. Well, this can be learned from pondering upon verse number 7 of chapter 51 of the Noble Quran, which states, and the heaven containing weaved ropes. So Allah Almighty states here that the heaven, it contains weaved ropes. The heaven is the volume surrounding a central object. Any volume which surrounds a central object is called the heaven. So Allah Almighty states that the heaven contains weaved ropes. What are these weaved ropes? From the Noble Quran you can learn that these weaved ropes are three strings weaved together. So as you can see on the screen, this is the weaved rope, three strings weaved together, vibrating strings. So Allah teaches us that these ropes, these energy ropes, are found in the heaven, whether it's the heaven of the earth or the heaven of the atom, which means that we have these energy weaved rope strings within the heaven of the atom. Now it's interesting to note that Allah God Almighty used the word ropes, since the function of ropes is to produce a pulling action, a tension on the objects on its ends, which means that these energy weaved ropes, they subject the nucleus to a pulling action from one end, and when one atom is brought into close proximity with the other, the energy weaved ropes within the heaven of the first atom will link with the energy weaved ropes within the heaven of the other atom, and a bond is created. So we can learn from the Noble Quran that atomic bonding, this is done by energy weaved ropes linking together, like tying two ropes together. So as you can see on the screen, when we bring two atoms into close proximity to each other, then the ropes from one heaven will link to the ropes from the other heaven, and an atomic bond is created. So we have a nucleus, we have two atoms, the center of these two atoms, and there are energy weaved ropes linking them together. So this is how energy bonds and atomic bonds are created. Now, So we can see, brothers and sisters, the amount of knowledge we can learn by pondering upon the verses of the Noble Quran and not just merely reciting them. So this understanding that atomic bonding is created by energy like ropes attached and ropes linking to each other, it's of paramount importance in understanding material fatigue. How is this so? Now, to start with the following case. Now, when we subject a material to cyclic loading, suppose that we have high stress. We are subjecting the material to a very high stress. Now, high stress is the force over area. You can think about like the concentration of the force. So when you subject the material to a large force, concentration of force, this means that in each cycle of loading, you are breaking up a large number of connecting energy weaved ropes. Again, if you subject the material to a high stress, this means that in each cycle of loading, you are tearing up a large amount of energy weaved ropes. For example, suppose that the two atoms, they have 100 ropes linking them. So if you are subjecting to high stress, this means that in each cycle, a large number, let's say for example 20 energy weaved ropes are broken or torn, which means that few cycles of load, the material will break due to fatigue. So if you represent this in the plot you see on the screen, on the y-axis we have the stress, which is the force over area, the concentration of the force, and on the x-axis we have the number of cycles to fracture. So point number 1 represents subjecting the material to high stress, and as I explained, from the Noble Quran we can learn that this will correspond to a small number of cycles to fracture. Now point number 2 represents lowering the stress. Now when we lower the stress, the number of energy weaved ropes stored in each cycle will be less, and thus the material can withstand large number of cycles till it fractures, and that is represented by point number 2. Now point number 3, again lower stresses, a lower number of energy weaved ropes being torn between the two atoms in each cycle, and thus a large number of cycles to fracture. Point number 4, we reach a point in the curve where the stress is small in a way that it doesn't break not even one single energy weaved rope between the atoms, and thus the material, every time you remove the load, it goes back to its original state, and thus it would not fracture due to fatigue. So there is certain stress. If the material is subjected to stress, then not a single energy weaved rope will be broken, will be torn apart, and thus the material will not fracture due to fatigue. This is a certain limit, and this limit is represented by the line, the blue line you can see on the screen. And if we connect the points we just deduced from the Noble Quran by a curved line, we see the figure shown in the screen. So this is the fatigue curve as deduced from the Quran, the last revelation of Allah to people. So we can see it on the screen, and this limit represented by the blue line, it's the amount of stress. If you apply at this line or below it, then the material would not fracture due to fatigue. Now this is the curve deduced from the Noble Quran completely. Now there are certain instruments, devices, where you can place a material in that device, and the computer can calculate the fatigue curve, can plot the stress with the number of cycles to fracture. So if we compare between the two curves, the one deduced from the Noble Quran shown on the left and the one obtained from these instruments, these devices, which show the fatigue curve, we see a perfect match between the two. So glory be to Allah the Almighty, we see a perfect match between the deductions of the Noble Quran and what's obtained from experiments. And we see, brothers and sisters, that Allah the Almighty teaches us this, such that the believer will be the teacher of others and not the one on the receiving end. Allah the Almighty wants a believer to show the miracle of the Noble Quran, to strive to make the world creator supreme. And in this day and age, this is done by knowledge, by showing the superiority of the Noble Quran in the field of knowledge. And to know more details about this topic, please visit my website at www.quran-miracle.com, and you can email me at zaidquran@yahoo.com, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you all.